Welcome back. I guess the Holy Spirit wants me to fly by the seat of my pants because I can't find any relevant notes. But let me kind of just, I don't want to say pick up where I left off, but I'll just launch in. As far as I can tell, there's only one disadvantage to being born a Catholic, to being a cradle Catholic, and that is how difficult it is for Catholics to be aware of what they have and what nobody else has. And this is also a reason why Catholics, in my humble opinion, don't evangelize enough. Is because there's a kind of, it's very hard to be aware of something that you've had all your life. It's much easier to become aware of something that you've wished existed all your life, and then you find it's there. And that's one reason why, we have these converts into the Catholic Church now who are doing some of the evangelization, like the, Scott Hahns and Rosalind Mosses and so forth. The picture that I have about what Catholics have in the Catholic Church and the difficulty of being aware of it if you are born Catholic, the image that I have is, we grow up in the United States, we have indoor plumbing, we have electric light, we have central heating and so forth. But imagine a primitive tribesman from, some village in the middle of Africa who has to rub two sticks together to make light and has to walk miles to a river to get some fresh water and so forth. If he came into the United States, he'd spend his first 6 months in amazement that if you want light, all you have to do is flick a lever on the wall, or if you want fresh water, all you have to do is turn a knob. Whereas we're oblivious to it, right? We can't really stay very conscious of it because we've always had it and it's always there. And that's kind of the position that Catholics are in. When I was growing up, my whole time growing up, I would have, I was tortured by not knowing the answers to the questions that Catholics have the answers spelled out in the Penny Catechism. What's the meaning of life? Who is God? What does God want from us? What happens after you die? Why make the effort to be good? So forth and so on. All of these questions, they're questions that it's very hard for a human being to be at rest in their soul without the answers to those questions. And everyone else out there doesn't have the answers to those questions that you have. And even non-Catholic Christians, by and large, do not have a very satisfactory answer to like one of the biggest questions, which is if God is all-powerful and if God is all good, why do good people suffer? Why is there so much suffering, of innocent people? Jews don't have an answer to that, by the way. The Old Testament doesn't have an answer to that. The best the Old Testament can do, it's like in this book of Job, is we know that God exists, we know that God is fair, and so we'll just take things, we'll accept that, but we don't have an answer to that question. It's very beautiful, actually, at the end of the book of Job, when God finally answers Job, right? Because Job is asking God, or Job and his friends are, wrestling with, why is there so much suffering and why do good people suffer? And when God finally answers Job, what's the answer? He says, I don't remember seeing you when I laid out the depths of the ocean. I don't remember seeing you when I separated, the land from the water. Who are you to tell me how things should work? But that's basically the best, and you know what I mean. I don't know if I'm being scatterbrained, but coming up to Christianity, that's about the best answer one has is, trust God and don't worry about it because we'll never understand it. Then you have Jesus, God himself becomes man one time in all of creation. And to do what? Basically to suffer and die. And we learn that suffering is the source of grace. Suffering is I'm trying to think of a way to put it. Again, without really knowing why it's the case, we know that there is nothing more valuable in the eyes of heaven than suffering offered up, particularly suffering offered up in union with the suffering of Christ. And we know that, Padre Pio said, if men only knew the true value of suffering, they would never pray for anything else. So even, I hope I get a little more coherent as I go on, but even basically there's no way to be happy without having what we have and are very hard to be aware of having in the Catholic Church through the answers to all these questions, plus through the intimacy with God, the personal relationship with God, which we have from being in a state of grace and particularly by partaking of the sacraments. Don't think that other people are just as well off in their religions, or that this is like the icing on the cake, but everything substantial they have if they are, God forbid, Muslim or Jewish or agnostic or whatever. We have the parable, of Lazarus and the rich man that Jesus gives, that the rich man is feasting at this table, overflowing with food every day, and Lazarus is the starving beggar outside the door that would love to just get a crumb which falls from the table, but he doesn't ever get offered it by the rich man. And then they both die, and Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham, and the rich man is condemned, and because he didn't share the wealth that he had. And usually that's thought of in terms of worldly wealth, which is true, that the corporal acts of mercy to feed the hungry and clothe the naked and so forth. But it seems to me it could be even more true for spiritual works of mercy, so to speak. In other words, as Catholics, we are the rich man feasting at that table, overflowing with wonderful things. And everybody who doesn't have what we have as Catholics is that starving beggar outside the door. And if we don't at least pray for the conversion of those who aren't in the truth, but even evangelize, even share the faith when we have an opportunity to, we're going to be called to account for it. Period. I don't mean to be threatening, but we're going to be called to account for it. I sometimes have the following. Okay, I was on an airplane. This is a true story. I was on the airplane, and I started to say my rosary, and somebody sat down in the seat next to me, and I kind of slid my jacket over my hand with the rosary, because I didn't want to be embarrassed. And now I realize how wrong that was. Now I kind of imagine the following, which is that we die, we are all going to die, we're all going to be reviewing our life in the presence of Jesus, and we don't want to be in the situation of seeing that film of our life go by and seeing that scene in the airplane and Jesus turning to us and saying, do you remember that time that you hid the rosary because you didn't want to be embarrassed? Well, I sent that person to you because you were the one chance they were going to have to get put on the right path and be saved. And because you didn't want to be embarrassed, they were lost. Whenever we have a chance to evangelize, they're basically, whenever we have a chance to evangelize, there's going to be a voice whispering in our ears saying, oh no, you don't want to do that. You don't want to appear superior. You don't want to be triumphalistic. You don't want to be thought of as a, medieval superstitious person. You don't want to offend them. There's going to be this voice in our ear trying to talk us out of doing it. And that voice is the wrong voice to listen to. And it's talking in our ear for one reason, which is it's the last thing that the enemy of our salvation wants to be done. So that's, I don't know, that's just a little 5-minute commercial to evangelize. When I was a student at Harvard Business School, and very anti-Christian, and I was walking across Harvard Square, and a Jews for Jesus shoved a mimeographed piece of paper in my hand, like a little leaflet. And it actually was this cartoonish drawing of Jesus wearing a Jewish prayer shawl. And it said something like, did you know Jesus was Jewish or something? And I immediately crumpled it up and threw it away in the first trash barrel. But the truth is I had never thought of Jesus as Jewish until then. And it didn't leave me very warm-hearted to the Jew for Jesus who had shoved it in my hand, but it definitely planted a seed that bore fruit, 10 or 15 years later. Looking back over my life, I can actually see a lot of situations where Catholics went out on a limb, where I responded with a great deal of hostility, and yet now looking back, I can see them as like stepping stones in what happened. We're probably not going to see the fruit of it. I'll give maybe one or two more examples. When I was very small, like maybe about 4 years old, when my parents would go out for dinner and a movie on Saturday nights, they would get this babysitter, this old lady babysitter. And one night when they were out and the Lawrence Welk show was over, I don't know if any, because she always insists on watching the Lawrence Welk show, she taught me the Hail Mary. I don't know where it came from, but anyway, she just taught me the Hail Mary. So my parents came home. She was obviously Catholic. My parents came home from the movie. And what's a 4-year-old do? They run up and say, look at what I learned, very gaily. So I run up to them and say, look at what I learned, Hail Mary, full of grace. And my parents went ballistic. They started screaming at this poor elderly Catholic lady. I remember her just saying, but it's the Hail Mary. Everybody has to know the Hail Mary. And I never saw her again, obviously. My parents never had her babysit again. But, it's pretty odd that I remember it, right, from 4 years old. I mean, it obviously made an impression. And when I got to MIT, I was very depraved and very dark, and into bad things that I don't want to mention, including drugs. And but there was only one person who I wanted to be roommates with, and he was a good, sunny Catholic from Rockford, Illinois. He was from a Catholic farming family in Rockford, Illinois. And I, moved heaven and earth, so to speak, to be his roommate, even though I just made fun of his Catholicism and made fun of his innocence and purity. But the fact was that he was happy. And he, in other words, all my friends were like me, like we were all, depressed and dark and kind of destructive. And he was cheerful and gay and happy and made you feel good being around him. So, okay, I better get on a track now. So I'll use that to get on a track because I wanted to talk about some other Jewish Catholic converts. So if I can find my notes here, I'll mention Edith Stein. Some people talk to me about Edith Stein, Saint Teresa Benedicta by the cross, and somewhere I had notes about. I want to be able to read the direct quote, but if I can't find it, I'll have to just ad lib. Her conversion. How did this Jewish kind of atheist philosopher come to the Catholic Church? There were several steps in her conversion. The first one was she was walking through town late one afternoon. I forgot the German town, and she saw this heavily laden, peasant woman carrying these heavy bags back from the market, who just stopped in a church, and she walked. This woman carrying the heavy bags walked into the church and just sat down, and Edith Stein observed her, and she saw that this woman was just sitting down in the empty church as though she was engaging in a conversation with an intimate friend. And Edith Stein recounts later in her memoirs that, she knew Protestants who prayed, she knew Jewish prayers, but this wasn't that. This wasn't reciting prayers. This was like somebody entering into communion with an intimate friend. And this was something kind of unknown to her, and this was something that she felt that she is going to have to understand someday. And then the next step was she had a close friend who, we're talking about the days of around World War I, right after World War I. She had her close friend who was newly married and very much in love with her husband, and her husband was killed in the First World War. And Edith Stein went to her friends to console her, to stay with her friend and console her. And Edith Stein could not understand how her friend had more inner peace about losing her much beloved husband than Edith Stein had about losing her good friend, who was this woman's husband. And she knew somehow that it had to do with Christianity and the mystery of the cross. And then later, the story that more people know is that Edith Stein inadvertently, so to speak, there's an overstatement, but sat down with Teresa of Avila's, I think it's her life, Teresa of Avila's autobiography, and read it cover to cover in one sitting that night, read it through to the morning, and put it down and said, "This is truth," and wanted to enter the Catholic Church. But it wasn't just reading Teresa of Avila's autobiography that did it. These other seeds were laid. The seed of seeing what prayer meant to this woman who stopped in the church, and seeing what understanding the meaning of suffering meant to her widowed friend. And neither of those people knew the eventual result of what they did, right? But that's what we can always do, right? If anyone wonders, how do you evangelize? You can just let people know, what your relationship to Jesus means to you, how you feel inner peace or joy after you go to Mass and receive Holy Communion, why you have peace about a piece of terrible news, your sense of divine providence. Basically, just letting people know what makes you tick and what what you are has to do with your Catholic faith and your relationship to God, which you subjectively think comes from your Catholic faith. And that's not imperialism. That's not imposing on anybody, because you're being completely subjective, right? It's just like, your experience, your prayer life, what your relationship with the Blessed Virgin Mary means to you, the comfort you get from praying the Rosary, whatever it is. When circumstances arise, just not to be shy about where what makes you tick comes from. Does that make sense? And again, if you start thinking that other people are more or less in the same boat, then you don't want to do it because you don't want to offend them. But if you start thinking that other people are Lazarus, outside starving to death, then you're more likely to want to go out on a limb a little bit. You're never going to be held to judgment for having looked foolish, by God. Not like we might be held to judgment for not sharing the wealth that we have that no one else has. So let me go a little bit into the wealth that we have that no one else has. Now, I'm going to, I am trying to convey, and I tried to convey this morning, I'm trying to think of how to put this, the total night and day difference between not being in the Catholic Church and being in the Catholic Church. And I try to do it through my experience and my words, so now I want to try to do it a little bit through other people's experiences and other people's words. And I will tell some stories from Honey from the Rock, which is the witness testimonies of other Jews who have entered the Catholic Church. Father mentioned Alphonse Ratisbonne this morning. Alphonse Ratisbonne was he was a Jewish convert, the second half of the 19th century, and I will tell very briefly a little bit of what happened to bring about his conversion, and then his experience of his own conversion. He was very wealthy. He was the heir to a Jewish banking family in Strasbourg, extremely wealthy, aristocratic he was due to inherit the bank, actually. He was, I think he was about 24, 25. He was very much in love with his young cousin, who was 16, a very charming and cultivated girl, and they were engaged to be married. But because of her youth, her age, she was only 16 at the time, Alphonse Ratisbonne was going to go on an around-the-world kind of tour for a year, waiting until she was 17 and they could get married. So the tour was going to start in Rome. He goes down to Rome, and he's lonely. He's waiting for the steamship, which is going to take him across the Mediterranean to Turkey or whatever to begin the tour, or to continue the tour. And he's lonely. He runs into a school friend, and the brother of a school friend who was Catholic, and this brother of his school friend who was Catholic, who lived in Rome, offered to take him around. I don't want to just ramble too much. I want to, kind of cut to the chase. Okay, so Ratisbonne was totally anti-Catholic. His name was Debussier. His friend was taking him around, showing him all the sights. His friend was a fervent Catholic, okay? And Ratisbonne was just making fun of everything on purpose, trying to offend his friend as much as possible. So really mocking things. It's too blasphemous, I won't go into it. But he mocked the holy stairs, the Scala Sancta. He mocked the papacy. He was just trying to kind of be as offensive as possible. His friend his friend's brother, who was taking him around, was very patient. And one night, first of all, when his friend was home one evening, he encouraged his wife and his two small daughters, to pray fervently for the conversion of Ratisbonne. And then Ratisbonne is over there mocking over at his friend's brother's house one evening, and he's mocking the Catholic religion. And his friend says, well then, if this is all so ridiculous and nonsensical to you, you won't mind accepting a dare to wear the miraculous medal for a month and to recite the Memorare once a day. And Ratisbonne says, I'm not going to do that. It's a stupid superstition. So the friend says, well, if you refuse to do it, it must mean that you put some weight in it. Because if it's totally meaningless, you would do it just to, amuse me or amuse yourself and cater to me. So Ratisbonne takes the dare and he does it. And he does say the Memorare every day. And a few days later, Ratisbonne is in Rome. His friend's passing by in his carriage. His friend says, hop on board. I'll take you around to see some sights. But first I have to make an errand and make a stop. So his friend stops at a church in Rome, San Andrea della Frata, to go in to make some funeral arrangements. Ratisbonne just goes into the church just to wait for his friend to come out. And then I'll go to Ratisbonne's words. So he's just walking around the empty church in the dark. And these are now Ratisbonne's words. I had only been in the church a moment when I was suddenly seized with an indescribable agitation of mind. I looked up and found that the rest of the building had disappeared. One single chapel seemed to have gathered all the light and concentrated it in itself. In the midst of this radiance, I saw someone standing on the altar, a lofty shining figure, all majesty and sweetness, the Virgin Mary, just as she looks on this medal. Some irresistible force drew me towards her. She motioned me to kneel down, and when I did so, she seemed to approve. Though she never said a word, I understood her perfectly. The whole church disappeared. I no longer saw anything, or rather, I saw only one thing. How can I ever even speak of it? Human words are totally incapable of expressing that which is inexpressible. Any description, however sublime, would only be a profanation of the truth. I was there prostrate, bathed in my tears, my heart beating out of my chest. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know whether I was Alphonse or someone else. I felt so entirely changed that I thought I was another self. I tried to find myself, and I couldn't. I climbed out of all I can say is that in a moment the blindfold dropped from my eyes, not only a single blindfold, but a whole slew of blindfolds that had enveloped me disappeared rapidly, one after the other, as snow and fog and ice disappear under the influence of the burning sun. I climbed out of a tomb, an abyss of shadows, and I was alive, perfectly alive. But I wept. I saw at the bottom of the abyss the extreme misery from which I had been pulled by an infinite mercy. I shuddered at the sight of all of my iniquities, and I was stupefied, moved to compassion, crushed with admiration and gratitude. Ah, so many men went calmly down into that pit, blinded by pride or indifference. They descended there to be swallowed alive in the horrible shadows. Oh, I was torn apart. Will you not raise your eyes to the Savior of the world, whose blood erased the stain of original sin? Oh, how hideous is the imprint of that stain. It renders completely unrecognizable the creature made in the image of God. I have been asked how I learned these truths, since I swear that I never opened a religious book, never read a single page of the Bible, and that the dogma of original sin, totally forgotten or denied by the Jews of today, had not for an instant occupied my thoughts. I do not think I even knew the name. I believe that I am telling the truth when I say that, without having had any book learning, I glimpsed the meaning and the spirit of the dogmas of the Catholic faith. I felt these things more than I saw them by the inexpressible effects that they produced in me. Anyway, when his friend came back, he was on his knees weeping. He immediately asked to be taken to a priest and baptized. He went to he was taken to the Jesuit church in Rome, and he asked to be baptized, and he was told that he would have to go through a course of instruction. And to which his reply was, "What? When the apostles preached on Pentecost Sunday, the Jews were immediately baptized and brought into the church, and the Queen of Apostles, evangelized me, and you're saying I have to wait?" And they relented. He was baptized. First he became a Jesuit, but then he actually left the Jesuits and started an order in the Holy Land dedicated to praying for the conversion of the Jews, the Sisters of Our Lady of Zion. And he dedicated the rest of his life to praying and working for the conversion of the Jews, not out of, needless to say, not out of an anti-Judaism, but out of a pro-Judaism. In other words, how could he not, how could his heart not be torn by, torn up by not wanting to share what he had received. In other words, seeing his friends and relatives and co-religionists, being left behind and not receiving the grace that he received. That order still exists, by the way. And by the way, every Jewish convert in this book basically pretty much has dedicated the rest of their life to working for the conversion of the Jews. That's why I'm doing this, by the way. I'm not putting myself in their category, but it just, I don't know, it just seems like it just happens that we receive this extraordinary grace and as Jews and are kind of consumed with the desire to have other Jews receive that grace. And where does grace come from? It comes from prayer and sacrifices offered up, mostly by good Catholics. So my real payment for doing this, so to speak, is encouraging Catholics to pray for the conversion of the Jews. I have prayer cards back there, which are free, by the way, with a picture of Wiederstein on the front and a prayer for the conversion of the Jews on the back. And when I get to the end of my talk today, I'll read that prayer for the conversion of the Jews. But now, I really don't know what I'm doing in being this disorganized. Anyway, I'll just go on. I kind of apologize. Let me go on with two other Jewish converts. First, I'll go on with Charlie Rich. Charlie Rich is a contemporary convert. He died in 1998. He was a Hasidic Jew. He grew up in Eastern Europe, in the Carpathian Mountains, and Hasidic family, very pious as a boy. The only education he had was Hasidic religious education. He used to go in the woods alone, was his favorite thing to do, and talk to God. But his family moved to New York. We're talking about 1940s, probably early 40s, late 30s. He lost his faith in New York. When he had lost his faith, there was no reason to live. He tried to commit suicide several times when he had lost his faith and there was no reason to live. One of the times Benedict Rochelle, Father Benedict Rochelle, was friends with Charlie Rich. They were friends. And so I heard the following story from Father Benedict Rochelle, so it must be true. Charlie Rich told it to him, obviously. One of the times that Charlie Rich tried to commit suicide, he went to a hardware store and bought rat poison, planning to go back to the apartment he shared with his mother and take the rat poison and die. This is the Lower East Side. I don't know if any of you know New York City, but this is the Lower East Side. When the Lower East Side was like a Jewish ghetto, they had a walk-up apartment. So he goes home. He walks up the steps to their apartment. He opens the front door. He's walking past the kitchen to get to the bedroom to take the poison and die. He passes the kitchen. His mother's in the kitchen making bagels. And she calls out to him, "Charlie, Charlie, come in and have a bagel. I made them just for you." And he figures, why not? Why not make her happy? I'm about to kill myself anyway, right? So he goes in the kitchen and he has a bagel. And she says, "Charlie, have another bagel. I made them just for you." So he figures, why not? He has a second bagel. And then he goes into his bedroom, closes the door, takes the rat poison, and lies down on the bed to die. And he wakes up, an hour or two later, violently ill. It turns out that the baking soda used as leavening agent in the bagels was an antidote to the rat poison. And then another time, which is really the point of the story, he tried to kill himself by hanging himself in a park in the Bronx. He had brought a rope. He threw the rope over a branch of a tree, but somebody came by and he chickened out, and then he's walking around. And it's a hot summer day. It's the days before air conditioning. The only cool places were empty churches. So he goes into an empty Catholic church just to get out of the heat and sit down there and get out of the heat. So he's sitting down in the pew, and he looks up at the window above him, and it's a picture of Jesus stilling the waters. And now let me turn to his words. So he looks up at the picture and he says to himself, "If only I could believe that the words in the Gospels are really true, that Christ really existed, that these words are exactly those that came from his own mouth, were uttered by his own human lips. Could it be possible, I felt, that which seemed too wonderful to be true actually was true? All of a sudden, something flashed through my mind, and I heard these words spoken in it. Of course it is true. Christ is God come down to make himself visible in the flesh. The words in the Gospels are true, literally true. The next thing I remember was that I found myself on my knees in fervent prayer and thanksgiving. Those few minutes brought such a profound change in me spiritually and intellectually that I have since that time been unable to recognize the self I had been prior to that experience. I felt a deep gratitude in my heart for something which made me feel very happy. All that I know is that from that day on, the name of our Lord Jesus Christ took on a significance which it never before had. The sound of these words to this day fills me with a strange, inexpressible joy, a joy which I feel does not come from this world. I have, since my baptism and First Communion, acquired a happiness which I would not exchange for anything in all the world. It has given to me a peace of mind and a serenity of outlook which I did not think was possible on this earth. It would have, in my case, I'll read more of this passage, but let me say that he again immediately asked to be baptized, and he spent the rest of his life, he was 33 when this happened, he died at the age of 98 or 99. He spent the rest of his life as a contemplative, living with the Jesuits, praying before the Blessed Sacrament exposed 12 to 14 hours a day. That's it. But anyway, so let me read some more his later reflections. It would, in my case, have been in vain to have been born had God not been good enough to extend me the grace to be a member of the mystical body of Christ, the Church of Rome is. Without the life Christ is, there is no life at all. It is for heaven we have been made, and for no other earthly good thing. It is to heaven every good and beautiful experience points and has in view. I became a Catholic so that I may in that way be happy, not just for a few years, but forever and ever. I became a Catholic that I may in that way get the grace to one day participate in the joys of the angels and saints in the life to come. It is to that life the grace of conversion is meant to lead. It is meant to lead to a happiness we cannot now imagine or conceive. It is not for this life alone that we are Catholics. We are Catholics that by so being we may get the grace to live the life Christ himself is, and which can never have a limit to it. It is for the boundlessness of heaven that we have been born. I did not become a Catholic to be happy in the present life, but in the one to love, but in the one to come, my holy Catholic faith being the way that leads to the eternal and everlasting kind of joys they experience in heaven. It is the heaven of unimaginable bliss my becoming a Catholic has in view. One can never come to the end of enumerating the blessings conferred on one by the grace of being a Catholic. Can the mercy of God be made more manifest than in the grace extended to us to be members of the only true church? It is being a Catholic that matters and not any other thing the world has to offer, however good and beautiful it may be. The Church of Rome gives us God himself. It does in all his fullness. A greater gift than God is, a human being cannot hope to receive. We receive the gift God himself is when we receive Holy Communion. It is to the church we must go to have God in the fullness he may be experienced by us this side of heaven. To become more intimately united with God than the church enables us to be by means of the holy sacraments, we must take leave of this life. Amen, right? This is Catholicism 101. But it's nice to, coming from the outside, one might see it in a little bit sharper relief. I don't know why I'm talking so fast. I have lots of time. Let me read at least, or let me tell the story of at least one other. It's probably the only other Jewish Catholic convert that I'll talk about, and then I'll talk about the mystery of the mystery of the existence of the Jews after the first coming, actually. In other words, this morning I talked about the role of Judaism leading up to the first coming, but that role ended with the first coming, right? So why didn't Judaism end with the first coming? Why are there still Jews around? Pope Benedict, I'll read the quote later, it's clearly divine providence that there is still an identifiable Judaism and an identifiable Jewish community in between the first and second coming, that it hasn't evaporated, right? That it hasn't disappeared. You read the Old Testament, it's full of the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Canaanites and so forth. And they were tribes much larger and more powerful than the Jews, but they've all disappeared long since. Why are there still Jews? And so there's a mystery to the role of Judaism. And the role of Judaism leading up to the first coming is actually pretty evident. That's why I could race through it in 3 minutes this morning, and it was pretty clear. What about the role of Judaism and the Jews between the first and second coming? And what about the mystery of the coexistence of Judaism and Jews and the Catholic Church and Gentile Catholics in between the first and second coming? So I want to tie up with that. So I want to spend the last 20 minutes of this talk on that. So that's why but I do want to squeeze in at least one more of these Jewish converts. So Hermann Cohen. Hermann Cohen was also the middle of the 19th century. He was a piano prodigy. He was a musical prodigy. He was a musical prodigy. He taught himself the piano at the age of 5 or 6. He was playing all of the popular opera tunes, self-taught on the piano. By the age of 12, his mother took him to Franz Liszt. Franz Liszt was the greatest pianist of the 19th century, and had Hermann Cohen play before Franz Liszt, and Franz Liszt immediately took him in as his protege, and then was his teacher and protege. And by the age of 14 or 15, Hermann Cohen was playing solo, sold-out piano concerts in all of the capitals of Europe, in Berlin, in Paris, in London, and so forth. And they were, he was really a superstar. In those days, that was the days before rock music, the closest thing that I can think of as an analogy is it would be like, being Mick Jagger or something. He was this incredible superstar. He was being hosted by kings and queens. Huge amounts of money were being given to him. He said that in a single evening, he would gamble away more than most men earned in a lifetime. I was shocked to find out there were groupies in those days, but there were groupies in those days. So he had a very dissolute, depraved life of, like a rock star today. And he went into a lot of darkness because of the sin, and he actually lost a lot of friends because of the selfishness and so forth that comes with that kind of depraved life. And then he's in his early 20s, and as I said, his friends were like kings and queens, and he gets asked to fill in as the choir master for a concert in a church in Paris. The choir master was a prince, and the prince was sick and couldn't do it, so he asked his friend Hermann Cohen to fill in, and that's what you do. You do favors for princes. It's a pretty prudent thing to do. So he agreed to fill in conducting the choir. What he didn't know was it was a benediction service. It was a Sunday afternoon benediction service. So Hermann Cohen's there just there to conduct the choir, but at the moment of elevation of the Blessed Sacrament in the monstrance, he feels a force forcing him down to his knees. And now let me read his words. At the moment of elevation, all of a sudden I felt burst forth behind my eyelids a flood of tears that did not cease to flow with voluptuous abundance down my inflamed cheeks. I remember having cried a few times as a child, but never did I know such tears. While they were drowning me, I felt surge up from the depths of my chest, split open by my conscience, the most tearing remorse over my entire past life. All of a sudden and spontaneously, as though by intuition, I offered God a general confession, interior and rapid, of all of my enormous sins since childhood. I saw them there piled up before me by the thousands, hideous, repulsive, revolting, deserving all of the anger of a sovereign judge. And yet I also felt an unknown peace that soon spread over my entire soul, like a soothing balm, that the God of mercy would forgive me these, that he would turn his gaze away from my crimes, that he would take pity on my sincere contrition, on my bitter sorrow. Yes, I felt that he would give me grace, and that he would accept in expiation my firm resolution to love him above all else and to turn to him from then on. When I left the church, I was already a Christian, as much a Christian as it is possible to be before baptism. He also was very soon baptized, and he became a Carmelite monk, and he spent the rest of his life traveling around Europe, barefoot, by the way, and he had been so famous that what he would do was there'd be announced free organ recital in a church, and thousands of people would come for the free concert, and then he would play the organ, and then he would preach, and he got literally thousands of conversions from his preaching, and everywhere he went, he opened up a perpetual adoration chapel. He reinstituted the 40 hours devotion of, he instituted, or he had like confraternities of men established in all these towns to pray before the Blessed Sacrament through the night. He reinstituted the Carmelite monasteries in England. There were none because they had all been suppressed with the Reformation, and he reestablished them, and he died actually as a martyr of the sacraments, because what happened was he was German. He was German by origin, but he did all of this in France. Basically, his conversion took place in France. He was a Carmelite monk in France, And then there was a war between Germany and France, and the French prisoners of war were all Catholic, and they didn't have a priest in the German prisoner of war camps to give them the sacraments, particularly the last rites, the final sacraments, because they were dying like flies in those prison camps. And the German government wouldn't allow a French priest to go to the prisoner of war camps because they were at war. But because Hermann Cohen was a German, he was allowed, his superior asked him if he would volunteer to minister to the French Catholic prisoners of war in the German POW camps, and he did. And needless to say, he was run ragged. Obviously, 18 hours a day, 20 hours a day, administering the sacraments, and a lot of course, last rites. And he was called to some prisoners who were dying of, I believe it was smallpox, and he wanted to anoint them for the last rites, but he couldn't find his little silver spoon for anointing with the chrism. And so he used his finger, even though it had a cut on it, and even though he knew that smallpox was so contagious. And so he anointed them with his finger and immediately got smallpox and died a week or so later from it. So he actually was a martyr of the sacraments. And when he became a religious, when he became a Carmelite, he took the name Marie Augustine of the Most Blessed Sacrament, or Augustine Marie of the Most Blessed Sacrament. I actually don't remember. And when he became a priest, he took a vow never to preach without extolling the Most Blessed Sacrament. Anyway, now I'd better go to the final phase, which is what about this mystery of Jew and Gentile in the church in between the first and second coming. And I mentioned I didn't mention this morning, I mentioned at the book table that the bottom line of this mystery of Jew and Gentile in the period between the first and second coming is that we know as Catholics that the second coming can't happen until there's a widespread conversion of the Jews. Paragraph 674 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church says, quote, "The glorious Messiah's coming is suspended at every moment of history until his recognition by all Israel." The glorious Messiah's coming is suspended at every moment of history. In other words, Jesus is just waiting to come again, but he has to wait until there's a widespread conversion of the Jews. I'm not making that up. So that's one good reason to pray for the conversion of the Jews if you want to see the second coming, right? If you want to live to see the second coming. And this teaching comes in large part from Romans chapter 11, which is really the mother lode of the theological basis for understanding the role of Jew and Gentile in the church in between the first and second coming. So I'm going to just run through that. I'll try to stroll through that. I'll try to slow down a little bit. So I'm just reading Romans 11, and I'll talk about it a little bit as I go. St. Paul, of course. "I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew." So just because the Jews rejected Jesus doesn't mean that God has rejected the Jews, right? Then St. Paul goes on to say, "What then? Israel failed to obtain what it sought. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened, as it is written, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that should not see, and ears that should not hear, down to this very day. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see." Okay, so this is very mysterious, right? The failure of the Jews to recognize Christ was not entirely their own fault, but as St. Paul says, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that should not see, and ears that should not hear. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see. So the Jews' failure to follow Christ was in itself a part of divine providence. Then St. Paul goes on to talk about why God did this. "So I ask, have they stumbled so as to fall? By no means. By their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead?" Okay, so again, I think this is actually very clear. St. Paul is saying, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles. Their trespass means riches for the world. Their failure means riches for the Gentiles. Their rejection means the reconciliation of the world. Clearly, St. Paul is saying that if the Jews had not failed to follow Jesus, the church couldn't have spread properly throughout the Gentile world. It was the Jews' failure to follow Jesus that enabled the church to spread properly throughout the Gentile world. What was the first major crisis in the church that required the first church council, the Council of Jerusalem in around 50 AD? What was the question? The question was, are we allowed to let non-Jews into the church? Or is the church only for Jews? So if a Gentile, a non-Jew, wants to enter the church, do they first have to become Jewish? And in the case of a man, that would mean undergoing circumcision, which, as I like to say, would have had a crippling effect on evangelization. But anyway. But that was a burning issue. This was the first big potential error, that you had to be Jewish to be a follower of Jesus. Why did that error come about? Obviously, because Jesus was a Jew, all of the apostles were Jews, the disciples were all Jews, the converts on Pentecost Sunday, those 3,000 that St. Peter brought into the church, they were all Jews. Christianity, the church, looked like a sect of Judaism, an outgrowth of Judaism. All the first wave of Christians were Jews. Maybe you had to be a Jew to qualify. That error, that potential error, which would have been really crippling for the early church, was avoided by the very failure of the Jews to enter the church. Their failure to enter the church meant that very quickly, within 5 or 6 years, the church was visibly Gentile. And there were as many Gentiles in the church as there were Jews, and no one could make the mistake that, if you were a Gentile in the church, you were somehow a second-class citizen in the church or something like that. But imagine if the 5 million Jews around Jerusalem at the time of Jesus all entered the church. Do you see how it would have blocked the ability of the world to see that this was not about Jews and Judaism? So that's clearly, I think, what St. Paul means when he says, through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles. But if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more will their full inclusion mean? For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? So he's saying, look, if it was such a blessing for the Gentile world for the Jews to reject Christ, just imagine what a blessing it will be for the Gentile world when they accept Christ, right? And again, I'm not saying, this is St. Paul, okay? If you go home, it's Romans 11, really, it's really there. And then St. Paul goes into the image of the olive tree, which is his image of this tree of salvation composed of Jew and Gentile. So he's comparing the tree of salvation to this olive tree. It's planted in Judaism, the roots are in Judaism, the trunk is originally Judaism. The cultivated olive branches that were originally part of the tree were the Jews. But then he goes on to say, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, a wild olive shoot, were grafted in their place to share the richness of the olive tree, do not boast over the branches. If you do boast, remember, it is not you that support the root, but the root that supports you. You will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. But do not become proud. Let me just do this. For even the others, if they do not persist in their unbelief, will be grafted in, for God has the power to graft them in again. For if you have been cut from what is by nature a wild olive tree, and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted back into their own olive tree? Okay, so you have this olive tree of salvation. The original cultivated olive branches were the Jews. Some of those were broken off. Those are the Jews who didn't follow Christ. But if you're, in order to make room to graft in the wild olive branches, which were the Gentiles. But if you're one of those grafted in wild olive branches, do not boast over the broken off cultivated olive branches. Because they were only broken off to make room for you, and God has the power to graft them in again, and when he does, they'll be even better suited to the tree because they were an original part of it. And then the church composed of Jew and Gentile, or the olive tree composed of original cultivated olive branches, grafted in wild olive branches, and then regrafted in original olive branches, depending on how you want to look at it, will be ready for the second coming. The church will be complete, composed of Jew and Gentile, and ready for the second coming. And let me continue with Romans 11. Lest you be wise in your own conceits, I want you to understand this mystery, brethren. A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of Gentiles come in, and so all Israel will be saved. So the idea was that this hardening has come upon the Jews until the full number of Gentiles come in, and then the veil will be lifted from the eyes of the Jews. They too will enter the church, and the church composed of Jew and Gentile will be complete and ready for the second coming. And then St. Paul goes on to say why God did this. And this is actually the most beautiful part. As regards the gospel, they are enemies of God for your sake, but as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. For the gifts and the call of God are irrevocable. Just as you were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now been disobedient, in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may receive mercy. For God has consigned all men to disobedience, that he may have mercy upon all. So this is a reason why God did this. If you think about it, I'll just go through this. Just as you were once disobedient to God, that's the Gentiles at the time Jesus came. They were out of relationship with God. They were disobedient to God. But they have now received mercy. They have been brought into the church because of the Jews' disobedience, because of the Jews' failure to follow Christ. So they have now been disobedient. The Jews are now outside of the church, so that by the mercy shown to you, in other words, through the intercession of Gentiles in the church, the Jews too will be shown mercy and brought into the church. For God has consigned all men to disobedience, that he may have mercy upon all. In other words, if at the time Christ came, the Jews had all entered the church, they at that time were in relationship to God. If they had been brought into the church, they would have thought they deserved it, right? We were always faithful to God. Now we have the full thing. They had to pass through a period of disobedience so that when they were brought into the church, it would be obvious to them that salvation was a sovereign act of the mercy of God and nothing that anyone could possibly earn or deserve. The Gentiles knew that because they were out of relationship to God. So when they were brought in, it was clear it was a sovereign act of the mercy of God. But the Jews had to go through a period of disobedience so that they would be out of relationship to God, so that when they were brought in, it would be obvious to them too that it was a sovereign act of the mercy of God. Make sense? And listen to this little line here. This is to intimidate you. So they have now been disobedient in order that by the mercy shown to you, they also may receive mercy. In other words, it's incumbent on the Gentiles in the church to pray the Jews into the church. Through the mercy shown to you, now they may also receive mercy. And this is also, by the way, the passage that's cited in the Catechism of the Catholic Church to explain why the teaching is there that there has to be, the Jews have to come into the church before the second coming can happen. So I was asked to stop at, I think, 3:30. So let me close, I guess, with the prayer for the conversion of the Jews. I have two prayers for the conversion of the Jews. I guess I only have one on a prayer card here, so I'll read that. That's on the back of the Edith Stein prayer card that I have out back. Those are free because I'm at least half converted, right? This is a completely kosher prayer. It was a postulatum at the First Vatican Council, which was in the 1860s under Pius IX, Saint Pope Pius IX now. And it is a formal invitation on the part of the church for the Jews to join the church. And it was signed by all of the council fathers. It was heartily endorsed by Pope Pius IX. So it's completely, as I say, a kosher Catholic prayer. So I'll read it. I'll try to read it prayerfully and not racing through it like a New York Jew. And I invite you, if you feel so moved, to silently join in the prayer. And if you want to take one of the prayer cards at the end of the day and have it to pray. The undersigned fathers of the council humbly yet urgently, beseechingly pray that the Holy Ecumenical Council of the Vatican come to the aid of the unfortunate nation of Israel with an entirely paternal invitation, that finally exhausted by a weight, no less futile than long, the Israelites hastened to recognize the Messiah, our Savior, Jesus Christ, truly promised to Abraham and announced by Moses, thus completing and crowning, not changing, the religion of Moses. The undersigned fathers have the very firm confidence that the Holy Council will have compassion on the Israelites, because they are always very dear to God on account of their fathers, and because it is from them that Christ was born according to the flesh. Would that they then speedily acclaim the Christ, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David, blessed be he who comes in the name of the Lord. Would that they hurl themselves into the arms of the Immaculate Virgin Mary, even now their sister according to the flesh, who wishes likewise to be their mother according to grace, as she is ours. Amen. Amen, and thank you.